Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. On behalf of David Ferrier, Archivist of the United States, I am pleased that you could join us today, whether you're here in the theater in person or watching us on C-SPAN or on YouTube. Before we get started with today's program, I'd like to alert you to two other programs coming up in this theater within the next week or so. Tomorrow at noon, we'll be screening part of JFK, a documentary first aired on PBS's American Experience. Part 1 chronicles John F. Kennedy's childhood, the World War II years, and his rise up the political ranks. Part 2, which we'll be showing next week on Wednesday at noon, May 31st, follows Kennedy into the White House. On Thursday, June 1st at 7 p.m., former members of Congress will consider the question of whether Congress is due for an internal review of its procedures and internal organization during a panel discussion titled Congressional Review, Can Congress Function at its Highest Level? To learn more about these and all of our other programs and exhibits, you can consult our monthly calendars, which you can take from the racks out in the theater lobby, or else you can go online to www.archives.gov/calendar. There's also a sign-up sheet, so if you'd rather have the calendar delivered to you by mail or email, you can go ahead and fill that out. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. George Washington was a dedicated diarist. His daily entries for life at Mount Vernon invariably began with a record of the day's temperature and weather, and then a summary of the notable events on the estate for that day. The entry for February 18th, 1786, just before his 54th birthday, is longer than most, for Washington appended, and I quote, "A list today of all my Negroes," unquote. The list totaled 216 persons, and the first child named was Oni, the 12-year-old daughter of seamstress Betty. Oni became the personal attendant of Martha Washington, and in 1789 accompanied the new president's family to New York. More of Oni's story, as part of the presidential household, is revealed in today's book, Ties That Bound, Founding First Ladies and Slaves, so I won't say any more here. Washington's diary and other writings are available online at Founders Online, a project of our National Historical Publications and Records Commission. Founders Online allows you to search across thousands of documents written by 6 of America's founding fathers and read the record of their thoughts, both lofty and mundane. Projects like Founders Online and Standard American Histories tell us much about the founding fathers, but to uncover information about the women of the founding area and the non-elite, we must dig deeper. Professor Schwartz examines both the founding first ladies and the enslaved women and men who served them and made possible the gracious lifestyle that they enjoyed. Marie Jenkins Schwartz is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Rhode Island and an independent scholar and writer. Her research focuses on the history of slavery, women, and children. In addition to the Ties That Bound, she is the author of Birthing a Slave, Motherhood and Medicine in the Antebellum South, and Born in Bondage, Growing Up Enslaved in the Antebellum South. She's working on a 4th book, tentatively called Scandal, First Ladies, Unfaithful Presidents, Politicos, the Press, and the Public's Insatiable Appetite for Salacious Gossip. Professor Schwartz has received 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and other awards, including the Julia Cherry Spruill Publication Prize for Best Book in Southern Women's History, given by the Southern Association for Women Historians. At the University of Rhode Island, she has served as Executive Director of the Center for the Humanities and as Chair of the History Department. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Marie Jenkins Schwartz to the National Archives.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I feel like I've come home. I lived in Washington for a number of years and logged in many hours in this building doing research for my first book. So today, first, can you hear me okay? Are the microphones okay? All right, good. Today, I'm talking about 2 of our most popular First Ladies, Martha Washington and Dolley Madison. Ties That Bound also looks at Martha Jefferson and her daughter Patsy, but I'm confining my remarks today to the Washingtons and Madisons. The other important people in the book are the enslaved people Martha and Dolley claimed as property. Martha Washington and Dolley Madison both supervised a large contingent of domestic slaves at their homes in Virginia, Martha Washington at Mount Vernon, and Dolley Madison at Montpelier. They also took slaves with them to serve in the executive mansion when their husbands became president. Slavery for Martha and Dolley was not just an economic system that made their lavish lifestyles possible, although in fact it did that. Slavery for them was a constituent part of daily living. By that I mean they were with slaves from morning until night. The relationship between the First Ladies and their enslaved help forms the core of my book, Ties That Bound. We admire Martha Washington and Dolley Madison for many reasons, and rightly so. For their patriotism, their social graces and fashionable attire, and for playing the role of hostess while their husbands served as president. Martha Washington is especially esteemed for traveling to winter camps during the American Revolution to visit her husband, General Washington, and the American troops. And Dolley Madison is particularly admired for saving from capture and destruction a portrait of George Washington as the British bore down on Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. Yet, we can't admire their slaveholding. Slavery was cruel. Violence or the threat of violence undergird slavery. Punishments for even minor offenses could be harsh, involving a beating or sale. Even when enslaved people did their owner's bidding, they could still be sold or moved for such reasons as the owner needed to pay a debt or the owner simply needed less labor. Slaveholders routinely separated families, subjecting all slaves, even young children, to psychological terror. This was true wherever slavery existed in the United States, no matter who did the slaveholding. It's hard to connect these facts with our founders, the men and women who did so much to establish a nation based on principles of liberty and equality. But in fact, the same founding fathers and mothers who did so much to champion freedom and equality made enslavement and inequality a part of their everyday lives by owning slaves. Our instinct, I think, has been to look away. We haven't wanted to think about our country's founders as slaveholders, but by turning away, we deny ourselves knowledge of the past and how we have come to be, who we are as a people, as a nation today. Our reluctance to look is understandable, I think. Slavery is disturbing, so much that people sometimes ask me how I can stand to research and write about it. I have a three-pronged answer. First is my belief that recognizing a wrong in history is a beginning of a way to make amends, or at least ensure that it doesn't happen again. Second, I'm a trained archival historian. I'm obliged by professional standards to reveal the past as it was, not as we wish it had been. I rely on my professional training when I'm in the archives or sitting at my computer reading or writing about slavery's atrocities. I liken writing history to putting together a jigsaw puzzle. You kind of have to think about the emerging big picture as you come across small bits of information. And I know that if I let my emotions overcome me, I'm never going to get that large story. Even so, I find sometimes I just have to pause and think about what's emerging, the small details, overwhelmed by the knowledge of what enslaved people endured. When I talk about slavery in places like this, I wonder about audience reaction, your reaction. I would think it's a difficult subject to listen to, which makes me appreciate your presence here today all the more. The third part of my answer about why I study slavery is that certain aspects of the story are inspiring, as contrary as that might seem. Slavery, when examined closely, becomes a human relationship. And by studying that human relationship, we can see the capacity for humans for cruelty, but we can also see the capacity of humans for resilience. Enslaved people were not solely victims of a cruel labor system. They suffered and they labored hard, to be sure, but they also loved, prayed, played, fought, and protested, despite the very real constraints imposed by a slaveholding regime. To be sure, slaveholders had enormous power, but masters and mistresses were never able to control completely the men and women and children they held in captivity. The first ladies discussed in Ties That Bound knew that human property was not like other possessions. The help was harder to manage. Oni Judge, Caroline, Suki, and other maids who waited on the Madisons and the Washingtons in the home could not be placed about exactly as the owners wanted, like sticks of furniture. Domestic slaves exercised a degree of human agency, and no matter how hard the mistress, the master, or other overseer tried, that could not be completely stamped out. I was not naive about how slavery worked when I started researching this book. I had written 2 other books on the subject of slavery. I knew that slaves could not be policed 24/7, despite the best efforts of owners to do so. When they weren't being watched, enslaved people took time for themselves and families. Somehow, despite working long hours for owners, most enslaved people managed to raise families, tend homes and gardens, form friendships, and entertain one another with music, dance, and stories. They carried out some of these activities with the approval of owners, but when an owner's approval was not forthcoming, they did what they could surreptitiously. Even knowing this, I was somewhat taken aback to discover the Washington slaves behaving like other slaves I had studied. This was George Washington, after all. As general of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, he had whipped together a ragtag band of men who had together defeated the mighty British military. Surely, if anyone could exercise an iron will over their slaves, it would be the Washingtons. Yet, like other slaveholders, they struggled to maintain complete control. They couldn't even keep children off of their prized yard. Despite expressed prohibitions, enslaved children frolicked on the well-manicured lawn at Mount Vernon, ruining shrubs and doing other damage in the process. When one of his farm managers vowed to George Washington that he would do a better job of keeping the children away, George thanked him for his efforts, but also expressed doubt that anything could be done. And he was right. One reason the Washingtons couldn't keep the children off the lawn was because they were unwilling to use the draconian measures that would anger the children's parents, some of whom worked in the house. The Washingtons had to walk a fine line when it came to disciplining any slaves, but they worried especially about angering highly skilled and prized house staff. This was the case with Boatswain, a young man who in 1794 hurt himself doing manual labor for his master. His mother, a domestic worker, had insisted that her son be given lighter work in the house while he recovered. When after 3 months, George's farm manager said he thought it was time to put Boatswain back to his regular work, George cautioned against it. He wasn't sure what might happen, but he was sure Boatswain's mother would do something and do whatever it took to keep her son from being assigned more physically taxing labor. I cite Boatswain's example to illustrate how domestic staff could, within the constraints of slavery, bargain to improve their own or their children's living or working conditions. While most of the power laid with owners who could employ violence, psychological pressure, the threat of violence, or threat of sale to make slaves do as they were told, no one wanted to sell highly skilled servants who took years to train, and no one wanted to go around beating slaves daily to get them to do their jobs. This was especially true of people who worked in the house, because people who worked there had access to both possessions and people, and could, everyone understood, retaliate. Everyone knew that when an important matter was at stake, such as the recovery of a son from an injury, slaves sometimes stood their ground. This knowledge gave Martha pause when it came to disciplining her maids, Caroline and Charlotte. Or I should say, having them disciplined, since mistresses rarely laid hands on. Caroline was courting to a museum exhibit at Mount Vernon, I'm quoting, one of Martha Washington's house slaves, who sometimes annoyed the Washingtons because of her slow work and failure to make production quotas, acts most likely practiced as passive resistance to being enslaved. The Washingtons periodically threatened to send Caroline to the fields as punishment when she displeased, but they never followed through. The seamstress Charlotte, like Caroline, usually performed work to Martha's satisfaction and avoided punishment when she didn't. But once, when she failed to complete a task, she was whipped. Charlotte retaliated by refusing to do anything for a while. She did not explicitly say that she was retaliating for the whipping. She was smart enough to know that doing so would surely bring even harsher treatment. Instead, she simply said she had hurt her finger. The Washingtons surely understood her behavior as protest. Refusal to work was a weapon slaves sometimes wielded against an owner when they found their living or working conditions intolerable. Under their moral and economic calculus, slaveholders expected a certain amount of work for the food, shelter, and other services they provided slaves, I know it sounds maybe odd to use that word moral compass with regard to slaveholders, but they felt they had one and that they were treating their enslaved help fairly. So I use that word even though that is not a morality that we would tolerate today. Enslaved people tended to cooperate with owners unless they were punished egregiously for a minor offense or asked or told to perform more work than usual. A slaveholder who tried to impose extra work beyond the normal, which was still a lot, or who punished especially harshly, could in fact produce the exact opposite result, as was the case with Charlotte. Such evidence demonstrates that the Washingtons couldn't direct all aspects of their slaves' lives all of the time. The notion that slaveholders did so simply is untrue, even for General and Mrs. Washington. Ties That Bound tells the story of how the First Ladies went about trying to maintain control over their enslaved help, and how the help went about defining themselves as more than Mistress's cook, more than her maid in the parlor. This struggle for mastery of slaves on the part of the First Ladies, and mastery of personhood on the part of enslaved people is a central theme in Ties That Bound. As I went about researching the book, I realized a number of popularly held and often repeated assumptions about First Ladies and enslaved people were untrue. One of them was the idea that Martha Washington and Dolley Madison accepted slavery because they had grown up with it and they really did not know another way to live. Another was that mistresses in general, and Martha Washington and Dolley Madison in particular, disliked slavery, but they could do nothing about it. The laws and customs of a patriarchal society left them helpless to take any action on their own. I found a kernel of truth behind these statements, but the facts as a whole told a different story. For one thing, Martha and Dolley both knew people who advocated an end to slavery, and some of them were members of their own families. Martha Washington's parents were slaveholders, it's true, but in the era of the American Revolution, many people were questioning slavery's place in the new nation. Northern states were in the process of outlawing slavery within their borders. And in Virginia, where the First Ladies lived, certain slaveholders were questioning slavery and voluntarily emancipating their slaves. George Washington became one of them. Toward the end of his life, he died in 1799 at the age of 67. George wrote a will emancipating his slaves, not at the end of his own life, but at Martha's death. He apparently did not want to disrupt her way of living by emancipating them before she died. Now, Martha at the time was a wealthy woman in her own right, and she did not need his slaves to live well. She, in fact, possessed more slaves than he did. Martha's were not hers outright. They belonged to the estate of her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, who had died in 1757. Martha had inherited the use of his slaves over the course of her lifetime. All of these slaves were to pass to Daniel's other heirs at the time Martha died. But there was one exception, Elish. Somehow, Martha had come to own him in her own right. But rather than to follow George's example and free Elish, she instead bequeathed him to her grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. She modeled her will on that of her husband's in all ways but this one. Hers freed no slaves. I'm going to return to Martha and what she did about George's slaves in a moment. Before I get to that, I want to say a few words about Dolley Madison's upbringing. Dolley Madison, like Martha Washington, grew up in a slaveholding household, but her parents, John and Mary Payne, were Quakers. And like other Quakers in the era of the American Revolution, they concluded that slaveholding was immoral and contrary to the founding principles of the nation. When Dolley was age 15, her parents sold their slaves and moved the family to Philadelphia. Pennsylvania was one of those northern states that were rapidly moving to outlaw slavery within their borders. Dolley's father said he wanted to start life anew in a free state. Dolley married a Quaker lawyer a few years later, and they had 2 boys. She might have lived out her life as a good Quaker wife had not yellow fever struck the city in 1793. Sadly, the epidemic took the life of her husband and one of her sons. The widowed Dolley possessed the means to support herself and her surviving son, but she was young and attractive and caught the eye of James Madison. A bachelor, he soon proposed, which put Dolley in a dilemma. He was an important congressman from Virginia, but he was also Episcopalian. And he lived a life of luxury on his family's Montpelier estate. His elite lifestyle ran counter to the Quaker ideals of plain living. Worse, the Madisons' wealth came from the 100 or so slaves they held in captivity. Marrying James would mean renouncing Quakerism and also the abolitionist principles her parents held dear. She took some time to decide, but she said yes. It seems that neither Martha Washington nor Dolley Madison were reluctant mistresses of slaves. Neither followed spousal or parental examples to renounce the concept of human property. But a question remains: what kind of mistresses were they? Biographers and certain historians have said that they were good mistresses. But what does that mean? One problem in defining any slaveholder as good is this: no matter how well enslaved people were treated, no matter how satisfactory their conditions of living, they longed for liberty. As George Washington's secretary Tobias Lear once observed of the Mount Vernon slaves, "They may be well clothed and fed and not subject to harsh beatings, but still they are slaves." Martha Washington's lady's maid, Oni Judge, agreed with this sentiment. Martha brought Oni and other slaves to the nation's capital when George Washington became president in 1789. The capital was located first in New York City, then moved to Philadelphia for 10 years before coming here to Washington, D.C., which I'm sure you know. Oni was well-trained and highly skilled. Her material conditions of living were better than those of most slaves, including most of the slaves belonging to the Washingtons. Martha, in Philadelphia, had given Oni small sums of money and permission to travel around the city on her own. Once, when the circus came to town, Oni went. But Oni fled one day after the Washingtons sat down to dinner. She made her way to New Hampshire, where she married and had children. Her life was not easy, but she preferred it to the one she had had with the Washingtons. She later said she wanted to be free, to maybe learn to read and write. Oni Judge's departure was a blow to Martha Washington. Oni was not only skilled, but Martha's favorite maid. Making things worse, from the Washingtons' perspective, is that their prized cook, Hercules, ran away around the same time. There were other runaways. From the time the Washingtons married in 1759 to his death in 1799, 1 or 2 slaves ran away from Mount Vernon each year. It was very difficult to run away, and it carried enormous risk. Not everyone eluded recapture, as did Oni, Judge, and Hercules. The ongoing flight of slaves from Mount Vernon, including those runaways who were caught and returned, serves to remind us that enslaved people did not think of their owners as good to them, certainly not in any benevolent sense. The number of runaways from Mount Vernon was pretty consistent with the number of runaways that left other similarly sized Virginia plantations. This, along with other evidence, indicates that the slaves at Mount Vernon fared no better or worse than those living elsewhere in Virginia. There's one way, though, in which the Washington slaves did fare better. His slaves, at least those who stayed alive long enough, eventually gained their freedom through the terms of his will. But even this is not the happy occasion we might like to envision. During the years of George's and Martha's marriage, her slaves had intermarried with his. When George's slaves were freed, there were 123 of them. Those married to Martha's slaves had to leave spouses and children behind. Some of the Washington slaves managed to stay near their families at Mount Vernon. But in truth, we don't really know what happened to all of them. Freedom, though welcomed, was bittersweet. The vast majority of Montpelier slaves, like those at Mount Vernon, seem to have fared no better or worse than other slaves in Virginia, at least while James Madison was alive. Had Dolley been willing to remain at Montpelier after James died in 1836, this might have remained true. But Dolley found life in the Virginia countryside tedious. She wanted to return to Washington, D.C., and reestablish herself as a preeminent hostess, a role she had relished first while her husband served as Secretary of State for 8 years, and then later, during the 8 years James Madison had served as president. Such a life took money, and unfortunately, selling Montpelier and its slaves became a way to raise it. The death of any slaveholder, not just James Madison, was an unsettling time for slaves. They understood that a financial accounting would follow and that they would figure literally in it. The enslaved people who attended James's funeral were visibly upset. One of Dolley's descendants took their sobs as evidence of a genuine, and I'm quoting her, bereavement in the loss of a kind and benevolent master. But as already pointed out, James Madison was no kinder or more indulgent than other slaveholders. Still, the tears the slaves shed were real enough. Rumors were already circulating that the president's widow would sell at least some of them. This fear was sufficient to account for all of the tears. But slaves who cried and carried on at the death of an owner were also participating in a ritual of long standing. Race relations in Virginia and throughout the South required that slaves and slaveholders outwardly appear to care about one another. Family members expected expressions of grief from slaves when a slave owner died. Slaves rarely disappointed. Breaking the implied paternalistic contract at such a momentous moment could have disastrous consequences. People who did not demonstrate the proper demeanor could expect to be among the first sold if it came to that. Appearances mattered, particularly to public figures like Dolley Madison, who cared about her husband's legacy. And so the slaves cried. They knew their fate rested in Dolley's hands. James had bequeathed them to her and made her executor of his estate. Dolley began selling slaves within 2 months of her husband's death. The slaves and others reacted with shock and revulsion. Dolley's cousin Edward Coles, an abolitionist, wrote in horror following an August visit to Montpelier. Every day or two, a Negro trader would make his appearance like the hawk among the pigeons. Like the hawk among the pigeons. Coles had spent some considerable time in the years leading up to James's death, helping him come up with a plan for emancipating his slaves through his last will and testament. Based on conversations and correspondence, he had come to believe that James had followed through and written a will that freed all or at least some of his slaves. Yet James's will, when its contents became known, said otherwise. Edward Coles was outraged. His slaves are not emancipated, he wrote his sister in late July. Someone, Coles thought, had changed James's mind, but who? Unable to pinpoint a culprit, he soon came to a different conclusion. There had to be a second will. I cannot divest myself of the belief that he has made a secret will by which his slaves will be free at the death of his wife, Coles wrote. The idea was plausible. George Washington's will had freed his slaves at Martha's death, but Martha had let them go early. She had become afraid for her life, since the only thing standing between George's slaves and freedom was her person. A mysterious fire that broke out at Mount Vernon added to her anxiety. Martha was also concerned about finances. Mount Vernon actually had more slaves at the time than could be put to productive use, and letting George's slaves go early would have saved expense. Martha was also worried about having George's slaves slated for freedom mixing among others at Mount Vernon that were not, the ones that would remain in bondage. And remember, Martha's slaves were not going to be free, and she actually had more than George. A lot of slaveholders worried. They thought that mixing slaves slated for freedom with those that would remain in bondage would just add to the disgruntlement of other slaves. And so Martha decided to let them go early. The Madisons knew full well what had happened at Mount Vernon, why Martha had done what she did, and they would not have wanted to put Dolley in a similar position. A secret will offered a solution. Americans, besides Coles, including the Madison slaves, also came to believe in the existence of a secret second will or some type of letter or codicil directing Dolley to free all or some of James's slaves. In fact, there is circumstantial evidence suggesting its existence. Edward Coles searched for the truth and eventually concluded, reluctantly, I should say, that his cousin Dolley had destroyed it. He was close to Dolley, and he didn't want to believe it, yet he could come up with no other explanation. I don't have time today to go into the evidence suggesting Dolley's culpability. I guess you can get the book and read it. Instead, I want to use my remaining time to talk about why we can't understand James Madison without knowing what Dolley did. Traditionally, historians and biographers have ignored Dolley and other first ladies when writing about the presidents. Instead, they ponder presidential papers and other documents written by men to figure out what James Madison and other presidents thought and did about important issues like slavery. But what if by ignoring the women, in this case Dolley, scholars have missed something important about James and the other presidents? Generally, historians and biographers, or certain historians and biographers, have seen in the early presidents a nascent abolitionism that, if realized, could have set the nation on a path that would have avoided civil war. This school of thought regrets the nation's embrace of slavery and postulates that the founding fathers might have done more to end it. For them, inaction on the part of the early presidents represented a colossal failure of leadership, a lack of political courage. News that George Washington had freed his slaves through his will had electrified the nation. Large numbers, probably most Americans, considered him a hero. John Adams followed Washington in office, and he owned no slaves. Thomas Jefferson came next. He managed to free only a small number of favorite slaves at the end of his life. The vast majority of Jefferson's people had been sold at a very public auction. And it was necessary to pay the debts that he had run up living as a grandee. For his slaves, it had been a heart-wrenching sundering of family ties. For the Jeffersons, it had been an end to a way of life and a public humiliation. No one wanted to see such a scene repeated. Many people hoped that James Madison would take concrete steps to further the cause of emancipation. He made statements that he didn't like slavery, and he said he wanted to see it end. But he clung to the unrealistic idea that freed men and women would need to be sent outside of the United States, specifically to Africa, if slavery were ever ended. Historians have criticized him for these ideas. They say they were fanciful, even delusional. But what if James Madison, like George Washington, had freed his slaves without insisting on their exile? Would he have inspired others to let their slaves go? Would he still be regarded as having failed the test of leadership, of lacking political courage? Would knowledge that Dolley had thwarted her husband's plan to free his slaves change our opinion of him, of her? The question is troubling. After all, women of the early republic are said to have exerted a moral influence on their men and on the nation. They made both better, it was said. But what if the independent decisions made by women were not always nobler than those made by men, and sometimes were less honorable. Also, the traditional picture of elite women, particularly the wives of powerful men like the presidents, has been one of dutiful wives following the dictates of husbands. But what if the women were not so dutiful and instead made independent decisions? These are questions I explore in my book with regard to Martha Washington and Martha Jefferson, as well as Dolley Madison. James Madison was keenly aware that what he did about slavery at the end of his life would shape how others thought about him, as it had for his predecessors. Yet he left the decision of what to do to Dolley. He had every reason to believe that she would outlive him. She was 17 years younger than he was, and he was in poor health at the time he wrote his will. If he hoped that Dolley would find a way to free the Madison slaves, he would have been disappointed to learn what happened. There was no auction, such as the one that occurred at Jefferson's Monticello, but instead there was a slow and steady scattering of the Madison slaves as Dolley arranged to sell Montpelier and transfer them to others. Many were picked off one by one or in groups and sold for cash, or relinquished to satisfy creditors who had accepted them as collateral for loans that were never paid. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read one brief paragraph from the end of the section on Dolley from the book. Of course, there may not have been a second will or any additional document. Even so, it is difficult to believe that Dolley was not involved in deciding what to put in and what to leave out of James's will. As her husband's health declined, Dolley began to assume more responsibility for helping him make decisions. During the former president's last years, she acted as his personal secretary, helping him with correspondence and other matters. She had always enjoyed a great deal of influence over James, and as he grew weaker, her power to sway him grew stronger. Yet Edward Coles directed all of his powers of persuasion at James, not Dolley. It was perhaps the greatest flaw in his scheme to emancipate the Madison slaves. He tried to convince the former president that his legacy depended on what he, not she, did about them. Well, let me conclude with just a few words about the larger picture, the one that emerges from the many stories I tell about the first ladies and their slaves in Ties That Bound. The Washingtons, Jeffersons, and Madisons are rightly honored for setting important precedents in the establishment of the nation. Unfortunately, one of the precedents they set was of slaves serving in the president's house. 5 more presidents, Monroe, Jackson, Tyler, Polk, and Taylor, would hold slaves while serving as president before the Civil War ended slavery in the nation. Yet we hesitate to acknowledge this inconvenient truth. The same founding Americans who touted freedom and equality also defended, or at least tolerated, slavery and inequality. Later generations of Americans would reject this paradox and come more fully to champion civil rights, human rights. But still today, we remain reluctant to acknowledge slavery's place in the founding of our nation. Is it because we, the public, want to celebrate our embrace of freedom and democracy without the discomfort that comes with acknowledging the subordination and exploitation of particular people? Or is it that we simply don't want to know the truth about revered founding figures? Is this why we have told ourselves they were good to their slaves? I thank you, and I think we have time for questions and comments.
Folks, if you have a question, there are microphones in the aisles.
Oh, yes. One on each side.
I've always been curious when I read the missing slave announcements. They don't seem all that descriptive, and there seems that there are hundreds of people that could actually match the descriptions that people publish. What was the chance of actually getting an escaped slave back? Were those announcements accurate enough that you could identify them? And the 7 years a slave people were falsely recaptured too, right?
Yes. Actually, the chance of being recaptured was pretty high. Only Judge and Hercules' ability to escape was what was unusual. It's not that you're referring, for those of you who didn't realize, is that slaveholders would put advertisements in the paper saying that a slave had absconded, and often giving a short description of the person. It wouldn't be very specific. George Washington actually put an advertisement in the Philadelphia paper after Oney Judge ran away. I don't think the idea was to describe enslaved people in great detail, but rather to alert others that there might be this person lurking around who would be a stranger. We have to remember that the population of the United States, even in the cities, was much smaller than it is today, and people would notice strangers and be on the lookout. And there were also people known as slave catchers who made a living out of knowing who was gone and looking around, rounding up the usual suspects, we might say, and trying to find out where they had gone. To show how hard it was to escape, Oney Judge actually was found by the Washingtons, and George and Martha made efforts to get her back. The problem was that he was president of the United States, and he didn't want to make a public spectacle out of what was going on, especially since Martha, or he said it would be unseemly for the president of the United States to go around chasing down a runaway slave. So he wanted to do it on the sly, which meant he was willing to bend laws, specifically the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which required the return of slaves, which he had signed as president. And he was willing to skirt that law, but then he could only go so far because he didn't want to drag her kicking and screaming back to Mount Vernon. That's kind of a long story that I do tell in the book, but I think the short answer to what you were saying is that these brief descriptions, they were often, well, sometimes they would run 6, 7, 8, 9 lines long, just like a classified ad that you might see in the paper today. It really wasn't so much that, it wasn't operating as something we might see today to flash a picture on, but just a warning to be on the lookout that there might be a suspicious person. And they didn't have any compunction about questioning free blacks and asking. The free blacks had to actually carry papers with them showing who they were, so anybody could be accosted. So it was not a modern way that we might think of tracking down slaves, but definitely they went after them, and most of them were returned. It was very hard to get away. I'd love to have questions. The book only came out last month, so it's like one of my first chance I've had to talk with anybody about the book, so I'd love to hear your questions and comments. Yes?
Hello. Thanks for your very interesting and enlightening presentation. I understand in connection with your book that you paid visits to each of the three historic homes and plantations, and I'm curious as to what, if anything, you may have learned in connection with those visits that may have enhanced the story that you're recounting today in terms of the perhaps part of the truth or the aspects of slavery that have not been told. Did those visits, what did you learn from those visits?
Well, I learned a lot. I went to Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier. I also went to other sites. One of the reasons I did that, as an historian, I want to get the lay of the land. I don't want to be talking about so-and-so was on the South Lawn, when in fact there was no South Lawn, it was a river there. So I just want to avoid those kinds of things. But I think more important is that at all of the historic sites, people are working very hard to uncover the story of slaves. And I think I'm glad you asked the question, because it gives me a chance to applaud the many, many scholars that are working on these topics. It's a labor that takes years. There are archaeological digs, for example, at Montpelier. If you go down there, you can take a tour of the archaeological sites that they're digging up to try to learn more about the slaves there. But Monticello and Mount Vernon are also doing the same. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever been to one of those three sites? So a good number of you have. You probably know that in recent years, all of the sites now are giving what they call a slavery tour. That is, they take you around and show you maybe some replicas of housing that slaves had lived in. I do address this topic in my book, though, although I want to applaud, and I'm so grateful for the time that some of the staff gave me. I talked with people about slavery. I worry a little bit because when you go on those sites, the slaves are still segregated in that when you go on the slavery tours, you're outside looking at slaves' quarters and everything. When you're on the inside, you're learning about the Washingtons or the Jeffersons or the furniture or Jefferson's library, the pictures that hung on the wall, the chairs that were in the great room. There's a great deal of emphasis on that, and it seems to me that when I was there, that the two stories needed to come together. That the presidents, first ladies, and their families interacted with slaves from morning to night. You cannot separate out the story. If you do, you don't have the whole story. And that was kind of an inspiration to me for writing the book, is I wanted to put the presidents and first ladies and enslaved people together in the same rooms, in the same places, so that we could understand the story better. Mount Vernon has this wonderful slavery museum that if you haven't gotten to, I highly recommend, that has just opened, I think, in January of this year. And they've done a much more thorough job of talking about the enslaved people who waited on the Washingtons. But still, I really think that we need to be thinking of what was going on when we walked through Jefferson's bedroom at Monticello. I would like someone to say, you know, the enslaved people came in and emptied the chamber pots in his bathroom. And they do point out his bathroom on the tour, but they don't say who was doing what. And I think that is something that maybe gets at this issue I tried to emphasize in my talk, is that we're just kind of reluctant to want to put them all together in the same room, in the same story. And I think we've reached a point in our history and in our uncovering of our past and wanting to know who we are as a people that we ought to be striving to do that now. But thank you for that question. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciated your turning out today. It was great.
And folks, don't forget there is a book signing in just a few minutes, one level up at the Archives bookstore.